sitting at the eve of the result for the upcoming elections, which will be in either ways a very important election for India, either ways, whoever wins. Now, so it's a good landmark to begin discussing history. One of the most interesting things about history is that we don't realize that we are living through history. For example, COVID was a landmark event in global history, a once in a century phenomena. But a lot of people may not understand that the implications or impact of COVID doesn't or has not ended with the end of COVID. In fact, अगर हम historically इस बात को कहेंगे तो हम कहेंगे कि we live in a post-COVID era now. जैसे post-World War I era, post-World War II era. In a similar way, we often say that we today live, आपने कहीं newspaper में भी पढ़ा होगा, we live in a post-COVID era. Why do we say that we live in a post-COVID era? Because the underlying implication is कि COVID तो खत्म हो गया, but उसका impact और उसने the overall world political, economic and social systems को जैसे impact किया है, वो impact is being felt even today and will be felt for decades later. For example, World War II ended in 1945, but we say we live in a post-World War II era. How did World War II change your and my life? Even a good 75 years or 80 years later, is that World War II eventually triggered the development of nuclear weapons. And once nuclear weapons were made, there was no turning back. In fact, we live in South Asia, which is the only place in the world where there are 3 nuclear powers, almost like bordering each other. There is no other place in the world where 3 nuclear powers share borders with each other and have long-standing conflicts with each other. Right? India, Pakistan and China. तो often जब major events होते हैं तो उसका impact काफी बाद तक भी देखा जाता है, and we may or may not in the moment realize how significant that event is, but when we have a distance of 50 years or 100 years, we are able to see how significant those events were. इसीलिए आप कभी भी देखेंगे तो आपके सिलेबस में भी, फॉर एग्जांपल आपका पोस्ट इंडिपेंडेंस हिस्ट्री का भी एक सिलेबस है, राइट? इट सेज फ्रॉम 1947 ऑलमोस्ट अप टू लिबरलाइजेशन, दैट इज 1990 या 92. क्योंकि इट इज ऑफन सेड दैट हिस्टोरियंस ऑफन से दैट टू राइट इवन द मोर डिस्टेंसेस between the present and the past, a better history you can write of the past. मतलब जो इवेंट्स आज से सिर्फ 10 साल पहले हुए हैं, a historian may not be able to do justice to writing a very accurate account of those events. But that is why your post-independence history syllabus doesn't stretch to 2010 or 2014. It stops at 1990. Historians have a certain element of consensus कि अगर 25-30 साल भी नहीं गुजरे हैं, so people may not be able to take a fairly objective account of the past. Rather, their understanding of the past may be very biased by their own perceptions, prejudices, and even by their own vested interests. इसलिए हमेशा कहा जाता है कि past को थोड़ा जब वो समय निकल जाए तो देखना चाहिए. For example, and this is last thing that I want to tell, and after that we'll start. When Manmohan Singh's term ended in 2014, he said whether I am a good prime minister, whether I was a good prime minister or not, or whether I was a strong prime minister or a weak one, whether I was a useful one or a useless one, historians will be able to judge it better than the media today. What he was trying to say is कि the report card of my prime ministership can be probably understood some 30-40 years later, not in the heat of the moment. Right? So, why am I trying to tell you this? That there is often a historical fallacy. Historical fallacy क्या होती है? जो हो गया, ये तो होना ही था. It was evident. This was meant to happen. For example, tomorrow, whatever result may come, one or the other person, one or the other group will say this was meant to happen. Right? Today, it is only today that the Indian stock market has gone up by God knows how many percent, almost 6 to 7%. I think 3.5% on the Nifty 50 has gone up, almost 2000 points se zyada. Meaning that the Indian stock market today has made a decision that the current government is most likely to be repeated one day before the actual result. It tells you how difficult it is to predict what? Even something which is due to happen tomorrow. And it is even more difficult to predict what will happen 5 years or 10 years or 15 years later. Just think of it. If it is so difficult to predict what will happen tomorrow, how difficult it would be to predict what will happen a 5-year or a 10-year later. पर जब वो चीज हो जाती है तो हमेशा ये कहा जाता है कि ये तो होना ही था. Why did I tell you this example? I'll correlate it to modern Indian history. Sitting in 1937, 10 years before India's independence, it would have been extremely difficult to say that India would attain independence in the next 10 years. There's absolutely no reason that anybody could predict that अगले 10 साल के अंदर भारत आजाद हो जाएगा. आप सोचिए ना, मैं तो आपको बोल रहा हूं, आपके पास एक दिन का प्रेडिक्शन नहीं है. At the same point of time, barely anybody could predict that even if India attains independence, it may undergo a partition. Okay, so but today when we sit, और आप जब पढ़ेंगे, ये मैं आपको बस एक ही लर्निंग से चालू करना चाहता हूं कि जब मैं आपको पढ़ाऊंगा मॉडर्न इंडियन हिस्ट्री तो आप मुझसे कहीं ना कहीं ये सवाल बार बार पूछेंगे कि सर 1916 में लखनऊ पैक्ट हुआ था, 1930 में जिन्ना ने ये कहा था, 1940 में ये कहा था, इंडिया का पार्टीशन तो इनएविटेबल था. ओके, इट वाज इनएविटेबल. इट वाज decided the day Muslim League was formed in 1906, or it was decided in 1916, or it was decided in 1930. Can anybody say that before an event actually happened, some 15-20 years before that it was inevitable? A question came in your mains examination that was the partition of India inevitable? Okay, so I'm not saying yes or no. All I'm trying to tell you is this, that we often presume that the moment something happened, we presume that this was meant to happen. ये तो होना ही था. Okay, and this is a very common historical fallacy. I'll give you another historical fallacy. The British established their rule over India. Most of you may believe that the British were the only major power जो मतलब बहुत ही क्लियर था कि मुगल्स एक बार जब उनका डिक्लाइन चालू हुआ तो उसके फॉर एग्जांपल द मुगल डिक्लाइन स्टार्टेड इन 1707 मोर आफ्टर द डेथ ऑफ औरंगजेब. और हम बात करेंगे तो औरंगजेब की डेथ होती है 1707 में, मुगल एम्पायर का डिक्लाइन चालू होता है. तो ऑफन स्टूडेंट्स अज्यूम कि वंस मुगल एम्पायर स्टार्टेड टू डिक्लाइन, ये तो ऑब्वियस ही था कि ब्रिटिश या कोई मेजर यूरोपियन पावर विल गो ऑन टू रूल India. There was nothing obvious about it. Sitting in 1800 or sitting in 1750, nobody could tell with any element of surety कि will the British rule India, or the French will rule India, or the Portuguese will rule India, or the Dutch will rule India, or their Gadbandhan will rule India, or there will be Indian princely states and Europeans all ruling over the Indian subcontinent. So it's very difficult to say. Can you tell today that what will happen 50 years from now? Highly unlikely. So how could somebody tell sitting in 1750s that by 1800 the British will drive out every other major player and become the most probable candidate to establish their rule over India? I'm still using the word the most probable candidate. कल के लिए भी आज most probable candidate की ही बात हो रही, right? I hope you get this context. This is just a way of thinking that I'm trying to first, give you a broad sense. Now, what are we going to do in today's lecture? Let's begin now. Okay. What are we going to do in today's lecture is that I'll first discuss with you a broad timeline about the events of modern Indian history from 1700 to 1947. So this is a broad timeline. it's a kind of a trailer for the picture. This timeline is very useful and very important. अगर आपको हिस्ट्री के बारे में कुछ नहीं पता है तो कोई दिक्कत नहीं है, और आपको पता है तो भी it will be useful for you. There is a timeline to which I will keep referring to in the subsequent lectures. Okay, and you should ideally write down this timeline with me. Okay, and go through this timeline over and over again at least 2-3 times. It will help you. Okay, put other things in perspective. Secondly, you will have other questions about which book to read, blah blah blah. That we'll discuss later. Okay, they are the less relevant questions, so we'll discuss those questions later. First, we'll do this. In the last half an hour, we'll discuss about which book to read, notes बनाने हैं, आपके नोट से पढ़ना है, किताब पढ़ना है, किताब में नोट्स कैसे जोड़ना है, एमसीक्यू कब करना है, आंसर कब लिखना है, all of that later. ठीक है, in the last 20 minutes or so. Let's first start with the modern Indian history bit, and you should write it with me. Okay, now if we start the discussion in modern Indian history, देखिए, just one thing I want to tell you is that modern Indian history, as you would know, is important both for mains and for prelims, and a good understanding of modern Indian history will help you in every other subject also. It will help you in polity also, it will help you in essay writing also, it will help you in ethics also. You will study a lot of Gandhi with me, right? And Gandhi is almost 250 marks in every year paper, is asked in paper 1, 2, 3, 4, essay, optional, हर जगह, right? So, and गांधी ही तो इस पिक्चर के हीरो है ना, भले गांधी पे पिक्चर 1982 में बनी हो, पर गांधी इसी पिक्चर के हीरो है ना. So Gandhi is going to be there. So you'll see that, and we'll keep coming to it. But what you'll see is that the application is not just for history, but for other subjects as well. How you can apply it to other subjects, that I'll tell you when we reach a point where it can be applied. Okay. और जितना आपको और subjects का knowledge है, उतना आपको फायदा हो. And so it's a very symbiotic relationship. For example, if you have some element of knowledge about polity, this will help. And it will also help you to understand those subjects, okay, because they're all interrelated. Now, but even if you don't, then also it's okay. Now let's, because I'll build those connections and bridges for you. Now let's start from 1700 to 1947. This broad phase, or this broad period, by the way, is the period that we call as the period of modern India. Now, why do we call this as modern? क्यों भाई 1700 से ही क्यों? Why not 1800? Why not 1750? Why not some other date? I'll answer this a bit later. For now, let's assume this. ठीक है. But we say, for example, the period before this, somewhere from 800 AD all the way up to something around 1600 AD, something which is considered as a more medieval period. Okay, so that is the more medieval period. After that, we say the more modern period. Now, in this modern period, why are we differentiating it into modern and medieval? That I'll come later. But right now, let's assume this. Okay. In modern, we divide the era. We can divide this modern era also into 3 phases. Okay. One phase is the period roughly from 1700s to 1800s. Okay. Another is an era where we can divide it more so from 1820s, to be precise, almost up till 1885. And the third is the era that we can divide from 1885, and to be frank, to be a bit more honest, we can even say 1885 or early 1900s to 1947. These 3 again. Why? देखिए, you are used to thinking कि हमें हिस्ट्री में क्या करना, रटना है. 3 फेज होते हैं. I am again going to the question, why 3? Why not 2? Why not 4? Why not just say 1700 to 1800, 1800 to 1900, 1900 to 1947? The question is why? Okay, I'll answer. I'm raising those questions. आपके दिमाग में भी आ रहा है तो बहुत अच्छी बात है, नहीं आ रहा तो आप भी जगाइए उन्हें, है ना. सवाल पूछने की पूरी आजादी है इस क्लासरूम में, बाहर का आप डिसाइड कर लीजिए, ना. तो विद इन द क्लासरूम यू विल हैव एम्पल टाइम टू आस्क क्वेश्चंस, बट लेट्स स्टार्ट विद दिस. नाउ this is a broad division. Let me start with giving you a broad blueprint from 1700s onwards. And what I'm telling you are not details, only a broad blueprint first. When we look at this phase from 1700 all the way up to 1800, it's a very interesting period in Indian history. A period which most students often don't pay a lot of attention to. By the way, I'll keep telling you which areas are important, kahan se sawal bhi puche jate hain. I'll give you broad sense here itself. Okay, because the idea is to study it more from exam perspective. So that's the reason. Now 1700 to 1800 is a very important period from your exam point of view. More and more questions, both in prelims and in mains, are being asked from this area. Why? The simple reason why is because students don't pay more attention to this area. Everybody thinks कि modern Indian history syllabus starts from arrival of British या revolt of 1857 या arrival of British early 1800 से नहीं. It starts from the decline of powerful Indian states, including from the decline of the Mughal Empire. देखिए, तो in 1700 एक बहुत important date है, that is 1707, when Aurangzeb, one of the last major Mughal rulers, died. Now this is one date you should remember. I will tell you which dates to remember. This is a date you should remember. 90% of the dates you don't have to remember in modern Indian history. 90% of the names you don't have to even think about. Dates and names are rarely asked in modern Indian history. They are asked only when they are very important. I'll keep telling you that. ठीक है. Other kind of questions are asked. Ancient etc. में थोड़े कई factual questions आते हैं. Modern में factual थोड़े कम आते हैं. ठीक है. More analytical questions आते हैं. So 1707 is the date when Aurangzeb died, and this is a date which we consider important because we say that a clear decline of whom? The Mughal Empire started. A clear decline of the Mughal Empire started from here. Now let me give you a perspective here, an important point to first understand. I'm drawing a poor map, but this would be enough to give you. अगर आप इससे भी बुरा मैप बनाते हैं तो आप सीख जाएंगे धीमे धीमे बनाना, है ना. It's a very basic geography में आपको सिखाया जाएगा ऐसे ऐसे बनाते हैं. तो if you look at this broader, people are very sentimental about maps. So I'm telling you, this got nothing to do with whatever you want. Okay, this is how broad. Now, if you look at this map, what you will find is that the birth of the Mughal Empire is something that happens around 1526. I'm not going into its detail. I'm just saying the birth of the Mughal Empire happens in 1526. Babur comes from somewhere in Central Asia, Afghanistan, and coming from Central Asia through Afghanistan comes to North India. Battle of Panipat hota hai, which is the third battle of Panipat, and you see which is the first battle of Panipat, and first battle of Panipat mein he defeats Ibrahim Lodi and everything and basically establishes his empire. नहीं पता कोई दिक्कत नहीं, जो भी लोकल रूलर थे उनको, आपको अगर नहीं भी पता है फर्स्ट बैटल ऑफ पानीपत, नो नीड राइट. Just remember that Babur established the Mughal Empire by defeating the Lodi rulers who ruled in North India in 1526. After Babur, and this is an important date, okay, then comes Akbar, Humayun comes, Akbar comes, all of that. We are not interested in that story right now. Okay, it is important but not right now. आप देखेंगे कि औरंगजेब जो है he ruled for 50 years, मोटा मोटा no exact year is important for you. I'm again saying, even if you say Aurangzeb died somewhere in the first decade of the 18th century, it's okay. ठीक है, बट ठीक है, अगर एक आध प्रिसाइज डेट याद रख लें तो कोई बुराई नहीं. औरंगजेब रूल फॉर 50 years, ये याद रखें. Okay, so roughly from after 1656 or 57 all the way up to for 50 years Aurangzeb ruled. The only other Mughal emperor who ruled for another 50 years before Aurangzeb was Akbar. Akbar, third battle of Panipat के बाद, after the second battle of Panipat, you will find that Akbar, from somewhere around 1556 to where Akbar was ruling from somewhere around 1556 up to almost something around 1606, 1607. 50 years of Akbar's rule. आपको क्या याद रखना है? एक अकबर, एक औरंगजेब, both ruled roughly for 50 years and both ruled roughly with a difference of 50 years between them. Akbar, 50 years gap, then you have Jahangir, Shah Jahan and all that. And then after 50 years after Akbar comes Aurangzeb. These two names you need to remember. 50 years of Akbar's rule and 50 years of Aurangzeb's rule. Why? For one basic understanding that you need to develop, that it is under Akbar that a major expansion of whom? A major expansion of the Mughal empire happened, first under Akbar and second under Aurangzeb. It is under Akbar that you will find that the Mughal empire was stretching from Delhi and Agra all the way in these areas. So whether it was Lahore or Peshawar or in the northwest, or you will find up till the Gujarat region, central India, this was the territorial extent of the Mughal empire under whom? Under Akbar by somewhere around 1606, 1607. Done. This you need to know. Okay. 50 years gap comes Aurangzeb, ruling for another 50 years. In the 50 years of Aurangzeb's rule, what you will find is that there is an expansion of the Mughal empire from central India more towards the Deccan and South India. Central India meaning up till your Madhya Pradesh, Narmada, if I was to say Narmada through Madhya Pradesh, but going south of Narmada into your Maharashtra, Telangana, Hyderabad, Andhra Pradesh regions, etc., and further down south as well. So we say that roughly in many of these areas into the larger Deccan region, there is a major expansion that happened under whom? And Aurangzeb's death, when it happens in 1707, this is a time when the Mughal empire is at its peak. In the 250 years of the existence of the Mughal empire, this was the time when the Mughal empire reached its territorial peak. Okay. And then we say after it begins the decline. Okay. Now, after it begins the decline. Now, why that decline happens? Why is that important? वो सब हम बात की बात है. But this is the only third time. This is only the third time in whatever knowledge of history we have of the Indian subcontinent of the past 4,500 years that there has been any power which has reached such huge territorial size. एक एग्जाम्पल एंशियंट इंडिया में मौर्यंस का दिया जाता है या अशोका का दिया जाता है. ठीक है कि मौर्यंस और अशोका के अंडर द एम्पायर रीच्ड huge size, okay, somewhere almost of a similar proportion. Okay. Then you see that after that, after Mauryas, हम एक आध एग्जाम्पल और जिनकी जब बात करते हैं तो एक आध और एग्जाम्पल्स की हम बात करते हैं, बट ब्रॉडली उसके बाद जो सेकेंड एग्जाम्पल है, सॉरी, so this should be the second example. This is the second example. That is the Mughals. और इसके बाद एक थर्ड एग्जाम्पल है, दैट इज द ब्रिटिश, whose territorial extent stretched almost across the Indian subcontinent. Okay, so there have been three, what we say, in 4,500 years, there have been more or less three pan-Indian empire. मैं पहले ही बता दूं, इससे पहले कि कोई मुझे करेक्ट करे कि नहीं सर आप गलत बोल रहे हैं. हाँ, मैं गलत बोल रहा हूं. आई एम यूजिंग द वर्ड almost. For example, the Ahoms in Assam were not a part of the Mughal Empire. Anything east of Bengal really did not become a part of Mughal Empire. In fact, even on Bengal, they had control after much difficulty. Okay, तो Ahoms जो असम में रूल करते थे, उनको मुगल्स नहीं हरा पाए, है ना. देखिए, I have to now take into account my challenge has increased. If there is one person's challenge which has increased over the past 10 years, it is that of a person who's teaching history. Because they have to teach history also, and they have to also know what is going on in the parallel university, metaverse, WhatsApp. So we need to know what is also being said in WhatsApp so that we correct ourselves beforehand. Otherwise, we are corrected in WhatsApp, right? So I'm using the word almost, right? So it was almost a pan-Indian empire. And so I hope this is clear. Now, what is to be understood is that what happens after 1707, when the Mughal Empire starts to decline in 1707, so it did not all of a sudden get replaced by whom? The British Empire. So it's not that there is an empire waiting and the Mughals and the British are fighting and they're like, let's fight and we'll decide. Whoever wins will take over the empire. Wars are never or rarely fought like this, and never or almost rarely you will find that wars result in a smooth transfer of power from one empire to the other. It's often messy, it's often chaotic, and it's often difficult to say at a point of time who's winning. Okay, wars are not like elections. Okay, so first thing here to understand is that after 1707, once the Mughal Empire starts to decline, for the next 100 years, there is no one power ruling most areas of the Indian subcontinent. In fact, you will find that there are a large number of regional powers. Okay, there are powerful regional states in India, and these are two kinds of states. Okay, so that is what I'm going to first explain to you, is that 1707 to 1800 period is the period which saw the rise of regional powers. Now these regional powers are of two types. One are those rulers who are the descendants of whom? Those who are the descendants of or successors of whom? Mughals. And there are others who had rebelled against the Mughal Empire. So there would be two categories of states. One are successors states of the Mughals, and the others are those who rebelled against the Mughals. And you will find that if I was to tell you that by 1750s, you would find, and especially let's even before we go to 1750s, there's a very important date, another important date that you have to remember. It's the date 1739. This is the time when Nadir Shah plundered Delhi. Nadir Shah is a Persian Afghan origin ruler who plundered Delhi in 1739. Delhi then was being ruled by the Mughal emperor of this time, जिनका नाम था मोहम्मद शाह रंगीला. वो आपको बाद में याद हो जाए, ठीक है? अभी आपको you don't need to worry. But 1739 is the time when Nadir Shah, coming from the Afghanistan region, plundered Delhi. And why is this important? because it tells you a very important fact. It tells you this is Afghanistan, and if you go a bit here, it is whom? Iran. Afghanistan. You all may know the map. If you don't know, you'll slowly figure it out, right? So coming from the Afghan-Iran border region, you'll see that Nadir Shah's plunder of Delhi, he comes all the way, plunders Delhi in 1739, and then withdraws from Delhi after a couple of weeks. Now, there's a very important date, because Delhi is the seat of power of whom? It's the capital of the Mughal Empire. And it has been plundered and looted by a ruler coming from India's northwest. What does this signify? It is the biggest evidence of the fact that the Mughal emperor and empire was unable to defend its own capital, right? And if a ruler is unable to defend their own capital, what do you think? Is their empire strong or already very weak? Already very weak. Nadir Shah faced little or no resistance from the Mughal Empire all the way from Peshawar, all the way up to Delhi, a proof enough of the fact that the Mughals had practically given up over ruling India's northwest. And Muhammad Shah Rangila was merely interested in maintaining his rule over the immediate areas in and around Delhi, and was unable to defend even Delhi. This is the time when Delhi is plundered. And it is the proof of the fact that the British did not cause the decline of whom? Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire had declined much before even the Battle of Plassey was fought. Battle of Plassey सबने सुना होगा, 1757 में लड़ा गया, right? और नहीं सुना तो मैं बता दे रहा हूँ, right? So much before the British fought any major wars against any Mughal ruler in India, the proof of decline of Mughal Empire was there for everybody to see, including the plunder of Delhi, in which Nadir Shah took away जो शाहजहां के एरा में बना था peacock throne, which was a throne made of solid gold weighing more than 100 kgs and which also had the Kohinoor embedded within it. तो नादिर शाह ने दिल्ली को प्लंडर किया. He took the peacock throne. अब वो peacock throne इतना भारी था, like this, too heavy to carry. Elephants also could not carry its weight. So they broke it into two. कि दो पार्ट में तोड़ के ले चलो, पर ले चलो. Right? And that is how the Kohinoor left the Indian subcontinent to return to India after a good 80 years, when Ranjit Singh got the Kohinoor back from the Afghans. रंजीत सिंह जो पंजाब के रूलर थे, जिसको नहीं पता कोई दिक्कत नहीं, ऐसा आप समझ लीजिए. मुगल से कोहिनूर लेके Nadir Shah went. From Nadir Shah, it passed on to subsequent Afghan rulers, and from then Ranjit Singh took, and from Ranjit Singh the British took, and then took it back, and then took it to London, and then one day Mr. Tharoor will get it back. You've seen on social media. What is India's most important pressing issue? We should get our Kohinoor back, right? So, here, the story of Kohinoor also tells you the story of many players in the Indian subcontinent. The Kohinoor often went in the hands of the most powerful. And at different points of time in India, different players were very powerful. Ranjit Singh in 1820s was one of the most powerful rulers in northwest India. So the Kohinoor was in his hands. Before that, Nadir Shah. Before that, Mughals. So the story of Kohinoor itself is a very interesting one. I'm not going there right now. But I hope you get a sense that the power balance kept shifting in the Indian subcontinent, and the British did not cause the decline of the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire was already in decline, right? So Nadir Shah's plunder of Delhi was a key event that signaled the decline of the Mughal Empire. Okay. Now, after this, what you will see is once the Delhi rulers are unable to defend Delhi, what happens is that the governors of the Mughal Empire, which were living in different areas, like where? In Awadh. Ye Awadh hai bagal mein. Awadh is where today 80 seats are, where the present and the future prime ministers of the country have already been decided. Tomorrow only the counting is going to happen, right? Adjacent to it is, cannot take many names because apparently this is going, the first one is going on YouTube also. I want to live. You should also live, right? Bengal, another very important state that will decide India's future. I'm talking about the past, not the present, right? Bengal. Hyderabad. These three, apart from Delhi. By the way, Bengal then is not a small state like today. Meaning it had West Bengal also, it had Bangladesh also, it had portions of Assam also, it had Bihar also, and it had Odisha also. So it is a very, very huge state. Okay. Bengal is like a super state back then. Okay. It's like the Uttar Pradesh of those times. Okay. So Bengal is a big state, Hyderabad is a big state, and Awadh is a big state, and Hyderabad ke niche there is another state, Karnataka, which broadly overlaps with coastal Tamil Nadu today. Okay. So all these four states were ruled by the governors of the Mughal Empire. Now the moment they see that the rulers of Delhi are unable to defend Delhi, they say this is the best chance for us to do what? To become independent of whom? The Mughal rulers. And these states are the successor states of the Mughal Empire. They have a symbolic link to the Mughal Empire. Many of these governors had served under Aurangzeb. Okay. And after Aurangzeb died, slowly they started becoming more autonomous of the Mughal Empire. I'm not saying independent, but autonomous. And eventually, after 1739, many of these states said, okay, thank you, bye-bye, to whom? The Mughal Empire and to the Mughal Emperor, saying that if the Mughal Emperor cannot defend themselves in Delhi, how will they defend us? So these are many of the successor states of the Mughal Empire which were coming to their own or coming on their own when? After 1730s and 40s. Okay. And these are big, powerful states. I'm not naming them small ones. They're the big, powerful ones. At the same point of time, once the rule of the Delhi rulers started to decline, not just those who had previously been a part of the Mughal Empire started becoming autonomous or independent. Those who had been suppressed by Aurangzeb or the Mughal rulers, they also started asserting their own freedom. One of the most important ones were whom? The Marathas. I'm talking in this period. So I'm not talking about the Rajputs and everything, because it is the Marathas who are one very powerful entity at this point of time. When? In the 1700s. Okay, as an independent entity. So you will find that the Marathas are an important rebellious state. The Marathas are an important rebellious state. Similarly, apart from the Marathas, and by the way, let me give you this context. Ki, dekhiye, that's why I don't like social media or media anything. Media is very problematic. Whatever you say can be twisted. One has to be more careful. When Aurangzeb was the ruler of where? The Mughal Empire, those 50 years was the time when the Mughal Empire was at its peak. But it is also the time when Aurangzeb faced a potential challenger whose rise from obscurity, meaning who was a nobody, but managed to rise and establish a powerful presence of his own. And as long as he was alive, despite being captured once by the Mughals, as long as he was alive, he managed to establish a strong state of his own, that is Shivaji. Shivaji, between 1660 to 1681, 1660 से 1681, in those 20-21 years, Shivaji had managed to lay the foundation of what was a nascent or was the beginning of the Maratha Empire. And this Maratha Empire, Shivaji had started forming at a time when Mughals were also at their strength, not at their decline. So this was not an easy thing to do. Shivaji died in 1681, and after that later Marathas also came. But the later Marathas were eventually suppressed by whom? Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb could not kill, let's say, Shivaji. But after Shivaji's death, the later Marathas were actually one by one suppressed by whom? I'm saying suppressed. I'm not using the word eliminated. देखिए अंग्रेजी या किसी भी भाषा में नुआंस भी है ना. आप बोले कि मतलब सर आपने बोला कि मराठास को खत्म कर दिया था मुगल से, मैंने बोला वर्ड सप्रेस्ड. कि मैं अपनी सलामती के लिए स्टेटमेंट ऑफ क्वेश्चंस इशू कर दीजिए. So you see that the Mughal Empire had almost suppressed the Marathas, but the Marathas did not vanish. As soon as Aurangzeb dies, one of the most powerful players which starts re-emerging in the Deccan are whom? The Marathas. Okay. So Marathas का एक major rise of Maratha power you will see where, or if I was to use an even better word, a resurgence of Marathas. Resurgence means जिनका फिर से उदय हो रहा है, because we say those 20 years is a time when Shivaji is there, the Marathas are coming on their own, but they are reviving themselves, especially after the death of Aurangzeb. There's a rise or a resurgence of Marathas when? In this period from 1700s to 1800s. This period is also known as, in many ways, one of the century of the Marathas, in the sense कि this is when Marathas का golden phase है इस period में, broadly speaking. More specifically from 1720 to 1760. But अभी हम नहीं जा रहे, but आप इतना भी याद रखिए. Apart from Marathas, there's another player here जिसको मैं बहुत my pro is not working, otherwise that would have been easier for me. Mysore, the state of Mysore. So Mysore as a state is a very powerful state between 1750 to 1799. इतना आप समझ लीजिए. 1750 to 1799, to be more precise 1760s में, but give or take, these dates are not important, but you write them down and draw it like this, because you will get a broad understanding of time periods. Okay, 1750, 55, 60, कोई दिक्कत नहीं. You need to get the bigger picture. So 1750 to 1799, Mysore is also becoming a powerful entity, and they are also not being ruled by successors of Mughals. In fact, many of them are rebellious states who want to establish their own powerful presence in the region. तो इस period में, and I'm not talking about this Ranjit Singh right now. Let's assume we are for now, I don't want to complicate this. So, because Ranjit Singh starts becoming powerful in early 1800s. But broadly, if you forget Punjab and Ranjit Singh for a moment, you will see that in North, Central and in South India, in 1700s, in the whole 100 years of the 1700s, there is no one pan-Indian ruler. In fact, there are a number of powerful regional states. So, is this political stability or is this political instability? Why would you say that this is political instability? Because there is no one ruler. But it's a wrong assumption. It's a wrong assumption. I'm using the word, there are a number of powerful regional states. I'm not saying that there is political instability, there is chaos, or this is India gone into a dark age. To give you a metric, why we say this is not political instability, तो आप बोल सकते हैं सर आप कौन होते हो डिसाइड करने वाले? देखिए एक की जगह कितने सारे रूलर हो गए, यही तो है पॉलिटिकल इंस्टेबिलिटी. ऐसा लग रहा है कोई कोएलिशन का मामला चल रहा है. देखिए, why this is not political instability is because I'll give you a perspective. I'll give you a very small perspective. ठीक है? महाराष्ट्र है, महाराष्ट्र. Anybody from Maharashtra? Okay. The geographical size of Maharashtra is same or a bit more than that of France. फ्रांस के बराबर साइज में महाराष्ट्र अकेला ही है. क्या समझा रहा हूं मैं? The territorial extent is huge. Only 3 times in 4,500 years has India been ruled by, not India, Indian subcontinent has been ruled by one empire. तो हम क्या ये कह रहे हैं कि इसके अलावा मतलब फुल ऑन पॉलिटिकल इंस्टेबिलिटी ही चल रही थी भारत? आप ये समझिए ना. What did I tell you? Historical fallacy. You often impose your imagination and understanding of the present on the past. एक second, I'll give you time. I'll give you time to ask. So one thing that you need to understand firstly is that it has rarely been in the history of the subcontinent that you had one power ruling over the whole subcontinent. That's one. The second point is, in this period from 1700s to 1800s, the Indian economy, if I was to say the Indian economy, meaning economy of these regional states, is doing exceptionally well. Put together, these Indian states of the 1700s had 25% share of the global trade. 25% share of the global trade, meaning it was exporting almost world exports ka 25% or 1/4. 25% was coming from India, 25% was coming from China, and 50% was coming from the rest of the world, including Europe and the Americas. Okay. I'll give you a sense. Today, India's share in the global exports and trade is roughly in the range of 3 to 4%. Back then, it was 25%. We were the world's biggest producer of textiles. दुनिया का सारा टेक्सटाइल और सबसे अच्छा सुपीरियर क्वालिटी का टेक्सटाइल was being produced in Indian states. Spices, from black pepper to cardamom to many other spices, were being produced in India and were being exported to the world. In fact, seeing the amazing amount of wealth that was being made by these Indian states attracted whom? The Europeans. We were not in a decline. We were flourishing so much. वो होता है ना आपके मोहल्ले में एक घर जो इतना बड़ा हो रहा होता है और इतना तेजी से बड़ा होता है कि सब समझ जाते हैं कि पैसा आ रहा है. Right? So the Indian economy was not in decline. It was not stagnating. And it was not a period of political instability. Yes, it happened at the time of decline of the Mughal empire. Okay? करंट का मैं वैसा और कोई एग्जांपल नहीं दूंगा, पर एक ऑब्जेक्टिव बात मैं आपको बता दूं. कल का रिजल्ट तक कल आएगा ही, है ना, और विकास विकसित और होता ही जाएगा सब कुछ. बट 2001 to 2012, which included the NDA years also, in the UPA 1 and the UPA 2, were some of India's fastest economic growth period that India has ever witnessed in the post-independence era, which was dominated not by one party but by coalition governments, which included both of the BJP and then eventually of the Congress or whatever, NDA and what is that? UPA. So that is another aspect. What I'm saying just as a reference point for you to eventually keep in mind later. But here, one of the things to first keep in mind is this, right? That this is a period of fragmentation of the Mughal Empire, a decline of a pan-Indian empire, rise of powerful regional states, arrival of Europeans, but not an overall age of economic decline of India. That's one context I want to establish. Yes, you're asking. कोई पूछ रहा था कुछ? हाँ, आप पूछ लो. Okay. So very valid question. What is asking is कि सर आप बोल रहे हैं कि उस टाइम पे you're saying that at that time there was no political instability, there were a number of regional states, तो क्या फिर इंडिया ही नहीं था उस टाइम पे? ये वो देखिए, प्लीज अंडरस्टैंड, इंडिया, अब ये सारी बातें गाली खाने का काम है, बट ठीक है, इंडिया as a political state in its current manifestation is a fairly recent phenomenon. Okay, it's a fairly recent phenomenon. India as a civilizational phenomena is a very old phenomenon. ये दो अलग चीज है, एक पॉलिटिकल फिनोमेना और एक सिविलाइजेशनल फिनोमेना. ये दो बहुत अलग चीजें. पॉलिटिकल और एज अ पॉलिटिकल एंटिटी is a fairly recent phenomena of a unified consolidated state with the current political boundaries. Is a fairly recent phenomena, but not as a civilizational entity, because as a civilizational entity it is a good at least a good 2500 years old, give or take at least 2500 years old. Okay, so you have to make a distinction there. So yes, as a political state of a unified political state with the clear, well-defined political boundaries that we see today, is a fairly recent phenomenon. Okay, so आप यहाँ पे 3-4 points लिख लीजिए, because that will help you, and if you have any other questions you can ask after that. Okay, so firstly you see here in this period the decline of the Mughal Empire, the rise of powerful regional states in India, which are both successor states and what? Rebellious states. And you have Awadh, or you have Hyderabad, or you have Bengal, or you have Karnataka, and you have rebellious states more like Marathas, Mysore. There is also in this period the arrival of the Europeans, and I will talk about them in a minute. And this is a separate important topic from your examination point of view also, because apart from the British, in India also came the French, and there were also the Portuguese and the Dutch. और पोर्टुगीज और डच पे अभी तक सवाल थोड़े कम आए हैं, तो अगले कुछ सालों में जरूर आएंगे. ठीक है. So there is the arrival of Europeans, you will see here. There is also what? This is also the period when the economy continued to flourish. The economy continued to flourish, so much so that almost 25% of the global exports. News में, I think in the newspaper there was a news 2 days or 5 days ago I don't read much of newspaper. I don't need to. Okay, you need to, so you should. But there was a news, I think, somewhere that India runs a trade deficit with 9 out of the 10 top 10 trading partners of India. It was there. आपने पढ़ी थी कि भारत दिन टॉप 10 कंट्रीज के साथ आज ट्रेड करता है, उसमें से 9 आउट ऑफ 10 कंट्रीज के साथ इंडिया रन अ ट्रेड डेफिसिट. मतलब हम उनसे इंपोर्ट ज्यादा कर रहे हैं एक्सपोर्ट की बजाय. But at this time, almost 25% of the global exports, we were the dominant power in textiles. By the way, textile is a big employer. Even today in India, one of the biggest employment sector is which sector? The textile sector. ठीक है, चाहे वो बनारस में हो, चाहे वो almost any other state in India में आप देखेंगे, textile is a big employer even today. Textiles or in spices, etc. So this was not an age of overall, or this was not a period of economic decline. ठीक है, ये broad pointers हैं, okay, for you to understand the 1700 and 1800 period. One thing I've not talked about right now is the Europeans. So let me give you some sense. Before that, any questions today? Anything you want to ask? For your question, anything that anybody wants to ask? No question? नहीं, अंदर पूछना अलाउड है. नहीं, मुझ बाहर भी आप मुझसे पूछ सकते हैं, औरों से मत पूछिएगा, खतरा है. Okay, so I'm saying 1700s to 1800 period में एक और important phenomena क्या है? The arrival of Europeans. The first Europeans to arrive in India in 1498 were whom? Portuguese. Portuguese आपको कहाँ देखने मिलेंगे अभी इंडिया में? गोवा. तो आप सबको कहाँ जाना है? क्यों? पोर्टुगीज को देख. राइट, क्वेश्चन भी आया है ना, गोवा में देयर इज अ बॉम्ब बेसिलिका चर्च. ओके, उस पे भी क्वेश्चन आया था प्रीलिम्स में. आई हैड विजिटेड दैट चर्च एंड स्टिल आई कुडंट आंसर दैट क्वेश्चन. ह्यूमिलिएशन है ना. द क्वेश्चन वाज नॉट अ इजी वन, इट वाज अ वेरी ट्रिकी वन. बट yes, you should go to Goa and you should see Portuguese architecture also. It is good, it is interesting. Did the Dutch ever establish their rule in India? Answer is yes. The Dutch also had a trading presence in Bengal. The Dutch also had a presence in Kerala. Okay, so the Dutch also were there. The British were there. French, where will you find the French in India? Pondicherry. So you should go there also, right? So Pondicherry was one of the power centers of the French in the region, right? So you will find these 4 major European powers had a rivalry amongst themselves over who will get a control of whom? The Indian subcontinent. Everybody of these powers, of almost all these powers, all of them wanted to establish a monopoly over doing trade with India. Between whom? Between India and Europe. देखिए, इंडियन स्पाइसेस एंड इंडियन टेक्सटाइल्स, और कुछ की बात मत करिए, बस स्पाइसेस और टेक्सटाइल्स की बात कर लीजिए. ठीक है, इंडियन स्पाइसेस एंड इंडियन टेक्सटाइल्स वर इन ह्यूज डिमांड इन यूरोप. So how were these goods reaching Europe? These goods were reaching Europe through whom? Through the European traders. And if I was to say that this is continental Europe, this is Africa, so this is Britain, this is France. ठीक है, यहाँ पे पोर्टुगल, स्पेन. मैप तो आपने देखा ही होगा, नहीं देखा है यूरोप तो आप कभी जाएंगे ही आगे घूमने फिरने, फोटो खिंचाने, किसी भी तो मैप आप देखना चालू कर दीजिए यूरोप का, ठीक है। सो यूरोपियंस डोंट अंडरस्टैंड whom they are dealing with now. They are dealing with Indians who have made it their life goal that they have to go to Europe once. We are 18% of the world's population. If all of us decide to go to Europe once, Europe is done. Do you get it? They don't get it. They are slowly realizing it. Okay, that Instagram is good for tourism, but then we come with not less, we come with too much tourism, right? And the moment, the day is not far that Indigo will fly direct flights. Indigo, cheapest flights, right? And Indigo will say, a day will also come and Indigo will say, we don't put seats in our flights anymore. पकड़ के चले जाओ और सस्ता देंगे. Indians will go. So, coming back here, this was extremely lucrative trade. I'll give you a sense. 1498 is the time when the Portuguese come to India through the sea route. The Portuguese are the original pirates. The pirates of the Caribbean, if was to be inspired by one European power, it has to be the Portuguese. P for Portuguese, P for pirates. Okay. They were the ones who were a major naval power which emerged in Europe in the late 1400s. Even today, more than 90% of the trade between countries, even today, is done by which route? Sea route. It is not done by land, it is not done by air. Land and air are either more expensive, and definitely are more expensive, or involve crossing political boundaries of countries with which you may not have always good relations. So that is why sea route, it is always said in world history that the one who controls the oceans controls the trade. Okay. So the Portuguese also understood this, and अब आपने सुना है कि वास्को डी गामा ने sea route लिया, and through the sea route Vasco da Gama came all the way through where? Through the southern tip of, मेरा अफ्रीका थोड़ा ज्यादा नीचे हो गया, but through the southern tip of Africa या South Africa के southern tip से, from the Cape of Good Hope all the way up to Calicut. 1498. Was the Mughal Empire here in 1498? 1526 I said ना. तो पोर्टुगीज तो किससे पहले आ गए थे? Mughals, right? The Portuguese reached before. Why? And by the way, they are taking such a huge sea route, such a long sea route. Why? Before Vasco da Gama, others had also tried and had not succeeded in finding this sea route. It is Vasco da Gama who discovered this sea route. This was an extremely risky move. It paid off for Vasco da Gama. When Vasco da Gama came to Calicut, he approached the Zamorin of Calicut, the ruler of Calicut, and said, I am here to buy only one thing, and that is black pepper. Kali mirch. Kali mirch, no? He bought Kali mirch and went back to, in 1498, he bought the Kali mirch and went back to where? He came and then he went back through the same route. The Kali mirch he bought here was sold in where? Portugal for a 4000% profit. 4000% profit. मतलब ₹1 का अगर यहां खरीदा तो वहां 4000 में बेचा. Only by selling black pepper, they made huge amount of profit, and this was only the trailer. The Portuguese were like, we know what we have to do. We have to ensure that all trade between Europe and the East happens through whom? Us. We should monopolize this trade. Seeing the Portuguese make this huge profit, other European powers are like, हम भी करेंगे क्या? We also want to do the same trade. 100 years later, after Portuguese come whom? The Dutch. And I'm not talking about the Dutch right now. अभी नहीं बता रहा हूँ. But आप ये समझिए कि after 1498, firstly it's the Portuguese, and after them come the Dutch. And by the East, by the way, by the East, they did not mean just India. India, Malaysia, Indonesia, and China. Malaysia, Indonesia, अंडमान निकोबार से आप थोड़ा और ईस्ट जाए, ऊपर मलेशिया, नीचे इंडोनेशिया, and further east जाए तो China. So the trade with them also was hugely lucrative. They wanted to monopolize all the trade with the East. Okay. And between East and Europe. India was one of the most important players. That's nothing. Now, the Dutch came. The Dutch started fighting with whom? The Portuguese. Because they said, we want to monopolize. 100 years later, give or take, 102 years later, 1600s tak is born whom? The British East India Company. By the way, the Dutch East India Company is also a private company. The Portuguese East India Company is a government company. The British East India Company is also a private company. Okay. The British are like, ये Portuguese और Dutch ने prove कर दिया है that we need to follow in their footsteps, and we also need to establish trade links with the East. After 1600, they formed the East India Company. They went and approached the Mughal ruler. This is the time when, after Akbar, during the period of Jahangir के टाइम में आपको रटने का कुछ नहीं जरूरत. After Akbar, 1607. I told you 1607 and 1657. Akbar and Aurangzeb, 50 years difference, both ruled roughly for 50 years. So 1607 tak, the East India Company, and coming to after Akbar, they're coming to the next ruler, Jahangir. Jahangir's the guy who loves good wine, enjoys life. Jahangir is the man. Okay, he knows how to handle a bottle or two. Jahangir is known to be a extremely good party. Abhi baki hai. The Portuguese approached Jahangir. Portuguese said to Jahangir, sir, why don't you adopt Christianity? Jahangir said, no, thank you. Why? Because the Portuguese hoped that Jahangir would become a Christian and would join the Portuguese Empire, so that the Portuguese could continue controlling trade with India. None of that happened, obviously. The British came. The British approached Jahangir and said, we also want to do trade with India. Jahangir said, do. You also do. What is the problem? By the way, this trade, is it beneficial for the British? Is it beneficial? Sorry, this trade, is it beneficial for Europeans? Or is it beneficial for Indians? Or is it beneficial for both? जब वो 4000% प्रॉफिट बना रहे हैं तो बेनिफिशियल उनके लिए हुआ. हाँ, उनके लिए हुआ, पर हमारे लिए भी हुआ. 1600s and 1700s, the trade relationship was a mutually beneficial relationship. Meaning, Indian traders, Indian exporters were finding a huge market in Europe for their goods, and they were also making good profits. It's true that the Europeans were making more profits, but they were also making good profits. And the Mughal said, okay, the Portuguese are doing trade in India, the British want to do trade, they must also do. Anybody who wants to buy our goods, buy, go and sell. Anybody who wants to do trade in India, you need a trading permit to do trade in Mughal territories. For that trading permit, you have to pay us money. हमारे चरणों में गिरना पड़ेगा. The British are like, दे दो, please, दे दो. Because you know this is a commodity in huge demand in Europe. The past repeats, may not always repeat like you would assume it to be, but it does repeat. Today, there's a country called the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. Congo जो है मैप पे देखे जाके कहाँ है Congo, है ना? Congo has today some of the world's majority of copper and lithium reserves. Everybody wants to buy copper and lithium from Congo. The Americans and the Chinese. Everybody wants to do trade with Congo. What happened to India? Those who often come as traders, they don't want to leave. Same may happen with Congo. और अफ्रीका का तो ये इतिहास ही रहा है, ठीक है, that the mineral wealth of Africa has often been its curse because it has attracted outside powers. Very common. पहली क्लास के लिए थोड़ा ज्यादा, पर broadly, I hope you get a sense. So what is happening is that in this period, the British come and they said, please give us trading rights. The Mughal said, you take the permit, you pay us for the permit, and we will give you trading rights for 20 years. And every 20 years, we will review whether we want to continue giving you trading rights or not. They're like, okay, done, sir. De do. Who's not happy? The Portuguese. The Portuguese like, if you allow the British to also do trade, then it will impact our trade. They said, the Portuguese said to the Mughals, we want monopoly. We just don't want trading rights. We want monopoly over trade. The word here is monopoly. And the Mughals are like, we will not give the Portuguese monopoly. We will not give monopoly to anyone. Everybody is open, is welcome to do trade, subject to our condition. That if you are here to do trade, do only trade. Don't bring in arms. Don't try to interfere in the domestic politics. Don't try to be king makers. Come, buy and leave. Who's not happy? The Portuguese. The Portuguese start fighting with the British. Okay, British और Portuguese में खूब लड़ाई हुई, फिर उन्होंने शादी कर ली. The British and the Portuguese naval powers fought for a good 50-60 years, and then the Portuguese realized that we can't defeat whom? The British. The British are a superior naval power. The one who will control the ocean will control the trade. The British naval power is superior. Let's have a marital alliance. The British and the Portuguese enter into a marital alliance, और दहेज में दहेज देना पुरानी प्रथा है. और दहेज में the Portuguese gave Bombay as a dowry to whom? The British. And said, अब हम ने दुश्मनी को रिश्तेदारी में बदल दिया है. So let there be peace between whom? The British and the Portuguese. And the Portuguese said, you do whatever you want to do. We will continue our presence in Goa and the areas of Daman and Diu. So the Portuguese became the first Europeans to come to India and were also the last Europeans to leave India. India attained independence in 1947. But the Portuguese continued to continue their rule up till 1960 in India. 1960 में the Portuguese left Goa and left India. So I gave you a broad sense of what is happening here. There is a European rivalry also ongoing, and यहाँ पे you can write a couple of points. I'll write with you. But you see, there is a major rivalry ongoing. When in the 60s. By the way, there's another one player whom? The French. इनकी तो बात ही नहीं करी हमने. अगर French would have ruled India, then India would also have been a part of some EPL, European Premier League, playing football. We play whom? Cricket. Why? Because the British played. If half of India would have been ruled by British and half would have been ruled by French, we would have mastered both the games. Isn't it? then we could have played in both the leagues. Then India would have IPL and football, Indian Premier League and Indian Football League going on same time, right? And then politicians would ensure that their sons also get two bodies to head. Why have one when you can have two? Okay, this is enough, I can say. What I just tried to tell you is that we often assume that the past is long gone and doesn't influence the present. Cricket is a great example. World over, cricket was a colonial game at its core. World over, the only places where cricket is still played in a major way were former colonies of the British Empire. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, West Indies, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, wherever, Kenya, all of them, right, were a part of the British Empire. The past continues to live and influence us also when we are not aware of how it influences us. You may think that we like cricket because we like cricket, but that's not the same case with football, right? G. Why they all have a similar desire to नहीं ऐसा कुछ नहीं, hold in India only. All of these European powers' interest is not just in India. Please let me tell you. Their interest is also in Sri Lanka. Their interest is also in Malaysia. Their interest is also in Indonesia. Their interest is also in China. All these. Was India the only power to be colonized? No. India was colonized. So was Sri Lanka. Right? And by India, when I'm saying India here, I'm saying Pakistan, Bangladesh, whatever. Sri Lanka was also colonized. Sri Lanka was also colonized first by the Portuguese, then by the Dutch, and then by the English. Malaysia, Indonesia, they remained under Dutch influence and control. Singapore went under British. So, what I'm trying to tell you is this. The interest is the same. All of these are the spice gardens of the world. It's an extremely lucrative trade. This trade is highly beneficial, and the economics is bringing these countries or these European powers to the doorsteps of whom? A number of these Asian countries, including India. हमारा फोकस एग्जाम का यहाँ है तो हम यहीं रहेंगे. आपका जीवन में जब बहुत समय और पैसा आ जाए तो आप ये सारी कंट्रीज को जाइए और देखिए, और आपको देखने मिलेगा कि कैसे इनके साथ भी वही होगा. पिक्चर वही है, किरदार बदले. तो that is there. So 1700s to 1800s, when I say that 1498 is the arrival of whom? The Portuguese, Vasco da Gama, through the Cape of Good Hope or southern tip of South Africa, alternative what? Trade route. I'm writing key points, okay? मैं यहाँ पे sentence. When we'll go into second, third, fourth lectures, wherever I need to dictate, I'll dictate. This is a broad framework, so I'm not dictating anything. You can just write the important points with me. You see that 1600s, that the British East India Company, a private company, is formed, and it also sought to establish first trade relations with India, and eventually even they also wanted a trading monopoly. Okay, so to establish trade relations with India or Indian states, and eventually a trading monopoly. Everybody is following till here? बोर तो नहीं हो रहे आप? नींद तो नहीं आ रही आपको? सोना भी नहीं चाहिए आप? अभी भी नहीं, आज के बाद आपको आज की रात आपको जागना चाहिए, कल सुबह रिजल्ट देखना चाहिए, फिर सोना चाहिए। नींद आपको चैन की ही आनी चाहिए उसके बाद, है ना। या तो आप मोक्ष की तरफ भी जा सकते हैं, कुछ नहीं रखा है इस दुनिया में संसार, या आप बोल सकते हैं कि धर्म की विजय हुई, जो सही लोग थे उनकी जीत हो गई। आपको पता है कौन सही है, और जो नहीं पता है तो अभी पता चल जाएगा अगले 1 साल। क्यों बोला मैंने 1 साल में? बिकॉज दिस इज द ईयर दैट यू विल बी प्रिपेयरिंग, दिस इज द एक्चुअल ईयर, this is the one year in which your actual broadening of mind horizon will happen. The Indian education system is notoriously inefficient. I don't think anybody would disagree with me. The Indian education system में ज्यादा कुछ होता नहीं है, दिन महीने में और महीने साल में बदल जाते हैं, है ना। गर्मी के बाद गर्मी हर साल आती है और आपका क्लास 1 साल आगे बढ़ता जाता है, बस इतना ही होता है। बट इन दिस 1 ईयर यू लर्न मोर देन यू वुड हैव लर्नड इन द पास्ट 20 years of your life, I can say with supreme confidence, because this is the only time when you are stepping out of the Indian education system. This is the only time when you are stepping out of the Indian एजुकेशन सिस्टम। जहां आप 2.5 घंटे की क्लास में बैठे हैं ना, आपकी अटेंडेंस हो रही है क्या? ना कोई पूछ रहा है कि कब आ रहे हो, कब जा रहे हो, कल आओगे नहीं आओगे, लेकिन आप फिर भी आएंगे। दिस इज वेयर एजुकेशन हैपेंस। फॉर एग्जाम्पल देयर आर मेनी यूनिवर्सिटीज इन द वेस्ट, वहां पे नहीं होता है अटेंडेंस। इन फ्यू यूनिवर्सिटीज इन इंडिया भी नहीं होता था अटेंडेंस, और बाकी जगह तो सिर्फ होता ही क्या है, अटेंडेंस। सो सम पीपल स्टार्टेड स्क्रैचिंग देयर हेड, ऐसा कैसे हो सकता है किसी यूनिवर्सिटी में इंडिया में अटेंडेंस नहीं होता है, मतलब यहां पढ़ाई नहीं होता हो। सो आई स्टडीड इन सच अ यूनिवर्सिटी जहां अटेंडेंस नहीं होता था, पर बच्चे फुला। क्लास में 100 सीट होता था तो 100-150 बच्चे भी आते थे, जितने वो कोर्स नहीं भी लिया होता था वो भी सुनने आ जाते थे। बट वो दिन और थे, वो जमाने और थे। What I'm trying to tell you is that the education system in India का हो चुका जो होना था। तो here you will learn more, and you will learn in this 1 year when you study politics, economics, history, geography, environment. Environment is a thing that most Indians, I really am amazed, have little understanding about today. Environment is India क्या पूरे दुनिया का सबसे बड़ा challenge, right? But you will study all of that, and I will tell you this. People often say that preparing for UPSC is a very stressful thing. I agree. To a certain extent, it is stressful because the selection rate is less. Less क्या मतलब? Very, 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 very 10 to the power of blah, blah, blah. Less. है ना? But it is stressful. That way it is. But it is also a very enriching and a fulfilling exercise, because you will get to develop a perspective about the world, something that will always help you in life. If you know, देखिए आप सबने सुना होगा ना एक लाइन, तो बचपन से अपने घर से ही सुनते आए होंगे, चाहे आप किसी धर्म, किसी जाति, किसी एरिया से आते हो इंडिया के, नॉलेज नेवर गोज वेस्ट। बट एवरी इंडियन फील्स दैट नॉलेज गोज वेस्ट अगर एग्जाम में सिलेक्शन नहीं है। कि नहीं कॉन्ट्रडिक्शन? Knowledge that you acquire here will not go waste if you know how to apply it in many other areas. This is one exam that prepares you for life, not just for, ये इसका साइड इफेक्ट ही है that it prepares you for life. इसका मेन इंटेंडेड ऑब्जेक्टिव नहीं है, but the way the syllabus of this exam has been made, it ensures that if you can't learn how to think, you can't qualify the exam. And once you learn how to think, it's very difficult to not think. है ना? कहा है ना, एक कहावत आपने सुनी होगी, ignorance is bliss. कि जब तक आपको कुछ पता ही नहीं है तो सब क्या चल रहा है, बम बम चल। आपके पास हर क्वेश्चन का जवाब। आपसे बोले कि इंडिया इज डूइंग ग्रेट इन टर्म्स ऑफ मेक इन इंडिया, ग्रेट सर, महा ग्रेट कर रहे हैं। एम्प्लॉयमेंट सर, एम्प्लॉयमेंट छोड़िए, हम स्टार्टअप कर रहे हैं। हर चीज का आपके पास फुल जवाब। क्या करना पाकिस्तान, हम बता रहे हैं, न्यूक्लियर बम ऐसे ही थोड़ी ना बना, वो एक मारेंगे हम 10 मारेंगे। सब चीज का आपके पास जवाब। 1 साल बाद आप अपने आप से ये सारे सवाल फिर से पूछिएगा, आप ही पूछिएगा। मैं तो पता नहीं रहूंगा नहीं रहूंगा, आप ही पूछिएगा, है ना। मतलब मैं दुनिया में रहूंगा, उम्मीद तो मुझे भी है, बट आप अपने आप से ये क्वेश्चंस फिर पूछिएगा। द आंसर्स विल नॉट बी टू यू very clear in white and black. You will start seeing a lot of gray. That is when what has arrived? Some amount of wisdom. Because you will not have very clear, definitive answers for everything. Okay, because there's often a more complex understanding that you need to develop. Okay. So, यहां पे what you need to write further is about the French, जो ये बात मैंने अभी तक नहीं करी, ठीक है, कि ये ब्रिटिश, और यहां पे मैंने आपको बोल दिया था कि by 1662 1664 there is a certain understanding between the British East India Company and the Portuguese, and there is a certain understanding between the two, and the British East India Company, backed by their what? Naval superiority. Backed by the naval superiority, emerged as the more powerful entity. Done. Emerged as a more powerful entity. Now, one thing I've not told you is about the French. Okay, let me go a bit into the French situation right now. Please understand that even today, the French, never in history, the French have accepted that they are inferior to whom? The British. Never. And often the British and the French fought wars with each other because both of them had powerful navies. Both were powerful states and both wanted to establish big empires. And 1700s में पूरी दुनिया में अगर एक powerful rivalry थी, it was between these two powers. Between whom? The British and the French. देखिए, I'll give you a certain context here, and this will help you later also. देखिए, the whole perspective of this class is to give you a 360-degree view, right? So, if you look 1700s to 1800s, and if I was to stretch it even further to 1900s, at least 1830s तक तो मैं कह सकता हूं, या even up till 1900. Yes, up till 1900 also we can say. In 200 साल the major rivalry was between whom? कहां? At the world level. After this, you see there is a change between 1910 to 1945. Broadly, okay? Please don't hold my collar later saying कि सर आपने बोला था वो 10 लेकिन वो तो 11 था, ठीक है? 1910 आपने बोला 19. I'm saying broadly. 1910 to 1940, the global rivalry was Germany, Italy, Japan on one side, broadly, okay, ऑस्ट्रिया भी है इसमें, बट ठीक है. और इसमें भी अगर एक आपको याद रखना है हीरो, तो ये है कौन? जर्मनी. ठीक है. So Germany is an exceptional nation, okay, like exceptional state. So Germany and started becoming so powerful, so militarily and economically powerful, that who got concerned? The British and the French. They're like, let's join hands. And the British and the French became friends. Against whom? The Germans, the British and the French. And partly the Americans also are supporting them. So America is emerging, right? When? In this period. After 1945, रशिया को हमने पिक्चर से बाहर रखा. देखिए, ये इतिहास गवाह है कि रशिया को जो जो लोग भूल गए, रशिया ने उनको समय समय पे याद दिलाया है कि हम भी. People, the West has often underestimated whom? The power of Russia. And Russia has time and again shown that those who have ignored Russia have ignored it at its own peril. Who ignored Russia? Everybody, including whom? Germans. So Russia played a very important role in the defeat of whom? Hitler and Germany in World War II. हम उसमें नहीं जा रहे, but ठीक. By 1945 time, when the World War II ended, Germany was such a powerful entity that the conflict that was World War I and II ended up destroying the military and economic power of Germany, but also of the victorious powers, Britain and France. They also became very weak. Who remained strong? And who emerged strong here? Soviet Union after 1945. तो आपने क्या देखा कि 45 टू, देखिए जीवन में आप में से कितने लोग नेटफ्लिक्स नहीं देखते? नहीं देखते. हाँ, नहीं देखते. वेरी नाइस. जो देखते हैं वो देख सकते हैं फालतू टाइम में. देयर इज अ 8-part डॉक्यूमेंट्री फालतू टाइम, है ना. तो देयर इज 7-8, आज आपके जीवन में फालतू समय हो तो आपको कभी देखना है तो आप देख सकते हैं. अबाउट द कोल्ड वॉर एरा एक बहुत अच्छा सा है, बट वो जब आपके फालतू टाइम, और फालतू टाइम नहीं है तो मत देखिए, इट्स नॉट वर्थ इट, है ना. तो इधर उधर देखने की बजाय आप एक शौक डेवलप करिए अच्छी डॉक्यूमेंट्रीज देखने का. उससे आपको लगेगा कि हाँ चलो टाइम पास कर रहे, तो YouTube पे खोल के वो आप जो देखते हैं ना कि जो भी कि ये 4 किताब पढ़ने से सिलेक्शन हो जाएगा और जो भी, वो मत करिए अपने साथ, है ना. तो one of the things you'll find is कि 1945 to 1990 is the global rivalry now between whom? US and Soviet Union, which includes Central Asian countries, which includes Eastern European. ये rivalry एक बहुत important rivalry है, which ended with the collapse of Soviet Union. And today we say there's a rivalry between whom? China and US. It is the global rivalry of which century? The 21st century. The US-Soviet Union rivalry was the most important rivalry of the 20th century. Of the 18th and the 19th century, the most important rivalry was which rivalry? तो अभी मैंने आपको क्या बताया कि 21st सेंचुरी में बहुत सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट राइवलरी कौन सी है? बिटवीन यूएस एंड चाइना. आप पढ़ भी रहे होंगे, कई लोग पॉलिटिकल साइंस में, कई लोगों को वैसे भी पता होगा. ठीक. इन दिस राइवलरी द होल वर्ल्ड is a playground where big powers play. Okay, meaning where big powers play their matches. It's a stadium. The world is a stadium where US and China will play. When? In the coming years. In Cold War, US and Soviet Union were playing a contest amongst each other. Where? In the whole world. कोरिया में लड़ाई हुई, उसमें नॉर्थ, देखिए पहला क्लास है, ज्यादा मैं नहीं, बट ठीक, आप ये समझ लीजिए कि ये लड़ाई करेंगे पर अपनी कंट्री में नहीं करेंगे, कहीं और बोलेंगे न्यूट्रल वेन्यू डिसाइड कर लो, वहां लड़ लेते. क्यों? बिकॉज इफ दे फाइट इन देयर ओन लैंड, on their own territory, it is likely to lead to death and destruction of their own population and of their own economy. Okay? Why am I telling you this? Because for 200 years, between 1700s to 1900s, the British and the French were very keen on settling their rivalry by fighting in third countries or in third geographies or in other areas. And one such area was where? In India. So 1700s में in India you will find, or again when I say India I mean the Indian subcontinent, you will find that the British and the French, and you should write down this with me, okay, this. In Bengal, in Hyderabad, in Karnataka, in Mysore, in all these areas, you will see that the British East India Company and the French East India Company were either involved in a direct or indirect what? Rivalry with each other. बंगाल में एक लड़ाई हुई थी जिसका सबने नाम तो सुना ही होगा, बैटल ऑफ प्लासी एंड बक्सर, है ना, सबने नाम सुना है. 1757, this date you need to remember, बैटल ऑफ प्लासी. एंड उसके कुछ 7 साल बाद बैटल ऑफ बक्सर, बैटल ऑफ बक्सर. ये दोनों बंगाल में हुई लड़ाई. Okay. This years you need to know. In Hyderabad, in the state of Hyderabad, you would find that there were 3 wards. Okay. These were called, in the area of Hyderabad and Karnataka, there were 3 wards. These were called as the Anglo-Carnatic wars. और ये जो तीनों लड़ाइयां हुई थी, ब्रॉड टाइम पीरियड यू नीड टू रिमेंबर, नॉट द एग्जैक्ट ईयर. ठीक है, बट यू शुड राइट डाउन दीज डेट्स. 46 to 48, 49 to 53, and 1757 to 63. 1750s, अच्छा, it's not visible नीचे, मैं बता दे रहा हूं. 1746 to 48 first, 49 to 53 second, and 1757 to 63 third. ये जो तीसरी लड़ाई है इसको क्या कहा जाता है? कितने साल हैं ये? 57 to 63, 7 years. It's called the 7-year war. इन 7 साल में, in ये जो in 1757 to 63, the British and the French were fighting कहाँ? Everywhere. Everywhere they could fight, they were fighting. Meaning, they were fighting in Hyderabad and Karnataka. They were fighting in what you know today as the United States of America. एक इधर और एक उधर, वहां भी लड़ रहे थे. क्यों, क्या, वो सब बात की बात. And they were also fighting in Europe. मतलब in these 7 years they are fighting in Europe, they are fighting in North America, and they are fighting in South Asia. In this 7-year war, many have argued that before World War I, देखिए वर्ल्ड वॉर 1 हुआ था 1914 से 1918 तक, ठीक है. वर्ल्ड वॉर 2 हुआ 1939 से 45 तक. क्यों मैं डेट बता रहा हूं, मुझे भी नहीं पता थी जब मैंने तैयारी चालू की थी, ठीक है. मुझे तो ये भी नहीं पता था मैप पे फ्रांस कहां है, पता था यूरोप पे, यूरोप कहां है ये पता था, बस, है ना. तो कोई दिक्कत नहीं if you don't know the dates, but now you should slowly start picking up some important dates. Okay, देखिए you've seen the movie लापता लेडीज. जिसने नहीं देखी जरूर देख लीजिए. ऐसा पहली क्लास में आप बकवास कर रहे हैं कि लापता लेडीज देख लीजिए. एक ऐसे में टॉपिक आया था आपके, सिनेमा इज अ रिफ्लेक्शन ऑफ इंडियन सोसाइटी और इज इट एन एजेंट ऑफ सोशल चेंज. इसलिए देख लीजिए, ठीक है. उसमें वो बोलते हैं ना एक स्टेटमेंट, देयर इज दैट लेडी हु सेज टू फूल दैट स्मॉल गर्ल अ स्टेटमेंट, तुम बेवकूफ हो, इसमें कोई शर्म की बात, इग्नोरेंट हो, इसमें कोई शर्म की बात नहीं है. तुम्हें अपने इग्नोरेंट होने पे घमंड है, ये शर्म की बात. अभी आप इग्नोरेंस, एवरीबडी स्टार्ट्स फ्रॉम इग्नोरेंस ओनली, बट इफ 1 year later you are ignorant and proud, क्योंकि कई लोग प्राउड तो होते ही हैं किसी भी चीज पे, है ना, तो वो नहीं रहना, इग्नोरेंस से ही चालू होगा. At the same point of time, do you know an interesting fact which I was told by somebody, that the movie Lapata Ladies has been a more watched movie than Animal. When Animal came, people were like, this is the reflection of Indian society, which it is, there's no doubt. But it is not the only element of representation of the Indian society, right? Many people were like that this is what the Indian public likes, you know, this is the kind of whatever, there's this patriarchy, this is violence, this is everything, and this portrays, it's a very negative role model for the society and all that, which is another thing. But at the same point of time, it also tells you that we should not be overtly pessimistic also. ना, लोग ऐसा नहीं है कि बिल्कुल ही बेवकूफ ही हो गए ना. So, and patriarchy is a all India phenomenon ना, it resonates everywhere, है ना, तो वो तो है. खैर, now coming back here, these are important dates where, and then there is, और ये सारी dates इसलिए important है क्योंकि इसके reasons है, वो मैं बाद में बताऊं. And there's another important period, and that is of whom? मैसूर. मैसूर है, मैसूर had 4 wars, एंग्लो मैसूर wars, 4 एंग्लो मैसूर wars. और अभी मैं इनके डिटेल्स में नहीं जा रहा हूं, बट फॉर नाउ यू जस्ट राइट, ये वॉर्स हो रही थी समवेयर बिटवीन 1767 ऑन एंड ऑफ between 1767 all the way up to 1799. ठीक है, all the way up to 1799. Exact time period पे I am not going right now. I don't want to overburden you with facts right now. I want to tell you a very important element through these dates. In all these wars, the British were fighting whom? The rulers of Bengal or Hyderabad or Karnataka or Mysore. But they were not just fighting whom? The rulers of all these Indian states. They were also directly or indirectly fighting whom? The French. In Hyderabad and Karnataka, the French were directly fighting with whom? The British. In Mysore, the British were afraid that the French will supply help through ammunition, arms, troops, or by some other means. To whom? Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, who were the rulers of Mysore. So, इस पूरे period में, when from 1750s all the way up till which period? 1750s to 1800, 1799, 1800. In these 50 years, the French are as important a player in this region as whom? The British. Ultimately, the British defeated whom? French. And because the British defeated French, they emerged as the, and because the British defeated the French, they emerged as the most powerful player in the Indian subcontinent. And that is why we learned English and we don't speak French. And that is why we play cricket and we don't speak and we don't play football. Right? Okay, I hope this much is clear. Now, details we'll see later. However, one important point also to note here is that the French East India Company is a government-owned company, whereas the British East India Company, as I told you, is a privately owned company. It will lead to an interesting question in your mind. कि सर आप बोल रहे हैं British East India Company is a private company, French East India Company is a government-owned company. How can a private company defeat the French power? And the French power and Indian states also. है कि नहीं? क्योंकि French East India Company was backed by the French government. But how come the British East India Company is able to outsmart the French? The answer for now, and is a very important point because this is very important later. Please understand, ये British East India Company जो है, it is a very unique entity. ठीक है? And it's a very unique entity because it has been formed in London by a group of people जो आए और उन्होंने एक कंपनी बनाई और उन्होंने बोला कि अब हम करेंगे ट्रेड. कहां से? ईस्ट. So they first went to the crown, British crown, saying, allow us that we will only be the only British company which will do trade with the east. मतलब कोई और British company ईस्ट से ट्रेड नहीं करे. तो हम बाद में बात करेंगे. British East India Company was given this. It's like saying that Indian government के पास एक कैब कंपनी जाए, say Ola, and says to the Indian government कि पूरे इंडिया में कैब सिर्फ हम ही चलाएं. Monopoly. They want monopoly from British Empire कि no other British company will do trade with whom? With India or the East. The British Crown gave it that monopoly. Why? वो हम सब बातें बाद में करेंगे. But East India Company could not even think कि it can deal with whom? The French, with a powerful navy and a powerful army on their own. तो ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी ने पहले तो अपनी प्राइवेट आर्मी ही बना ली. इट इज द फर्स्ट कंपनी which was a powerful company said कि we need to make our own army. So they made their own army. और इसमें इस आर्मी को बनाने के लिए एक बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट रोल प्ले किया था one of my personal favorites, not because I like him, पहले मैं disclaimer दे दूं, my personal favorite for the kind of story this guy has, Robert Clive. नाम आपने सुना हो? नहीं सुना, मैं बता दे रहा हूं, आगे आप सुनेंगे. रॉबर्ट क्लाइव. अगर आप जीवन में पढ़ाई में अच्छे ना हो और मार पिटाई में आगे हो बचपन से ही, तो आपका फ्यूचर ब्राइट है. रॉबर्ट क्लाइव never displayed any academic excellence, was very good in fighting, would beat up children in school right from school days. Went on to make a fortune for himself. बाहुबली की जरूरत है ना. तो that is that. But Clive started raising and played a very important role in raising an army for the British East India Company. But because camera is there, so I can't say. But still, it is like Apple saying Why to talk about Indian company? It is like Apple saying, I am the most profitable company in the world. Let me have an army of my own. तो ब्रिटिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी लाइक बना लेता, ब्रिटिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी बनाई. Though they made a powerful army, they still could not deal with whom? The French. They're like, we need the help of the British, Royal British Army. They approached the crown and said, send the army to protect our interest. And the British crown sent the army to protect the interest of a private company, the British East India Company. So while fighting the French, the East India Company was not fighting alone. It had its own private army backed by the British government's army. Okay. And that is how they were able to defeat whom? The French. It was not an easy fight, and it was not a fight that the British were always winning. There were times where it seemed that the French will emerge as victorious, but वो नहीं हुआ. So I hope that this is clear. I have tried to give you a sense also of the relationship between the Crown and the British East India Company. By the way, if the Crown is helping the East India Company, the Crown would also be expecting some benefits from whom? Yes or no? तो वो था, it is a mutually beneficial relationship. Okay. चलिए, अभी के लिए इतना काफी. तो यहां पे आपको जो समझने वाली बात है, that the British East India Company, supported by the British Crown, outsmarted whom? The French from the region. ये सब कहां हो गया? 1700s to 1800s. 1800s के एंड तक क्या होता है? आई एम ड्रॉइंग द नेक्स्ट मैप. उसको आप थोड़ा बड़ा बड़ा और थोड़ा खुला एक नेक्स्ट पेज पे बना लीजिए. ठीक है? Written this. देखिए यहां पे आई एम राइटिंग इंपॉर्टेंट डेट्स पूरी 1700 की 1800 की. वो आपको अभी लिखना है. नो नीड टू गेट इंटिमिडेटेड कि कैसे रटेंगे, क्या करना है, सब मैं बता दूंगा. Some of those dates I just wrote before. In Bengal, you have the Battle of Plassey in 1757, and after that the Battle of Buxar in 1764. By the way, if you now see Hyderabad and Carnatic, इसमें लड़ाई एक साथ हो रही है. That is the Anglo Carnatic, and this is happening 3. I just told you. I'm not, should I repeat? Okay. 46 to 8. 49 to 53, and the 7-year war जिसके बारे में मैंने आपको बताया था 263. एंड रिमेंबर मैंने बोला ना कि 7-year war कहां कहां हो रही थी? नॉर्थ अमेरिका, यूरोप एंड साउथ एशिया या इंडियन सब कॉन्टिनेंट. नॉर्थ अमेरिका, यूरोप एंड इंडियन सब कॉन्टिनेंट. देन आई सेड मैसूर, और यहां पे there are 4 wars, 67 to 69, 1767 to 69. ये लिख लिया ना सबने? ये तो what is there? I'm just repeating. 67 to 69, 1760, sorry, 17 80 to 84, 89 to 92, and 1799. 4 wars. If this doesn't go up, that's my problem. The next class, I'll use this. So there I can move it up so that you can see. First war in Mysore, 67 to 69. Second war, 80 to 84. 1780 to 84. Third war, 1789 to 92. And fourth war, 1799. These are the 4 Anglo-Mysore wars. और इसके ऊपर is what? इसके ऊपर there is the Marathas. Maharashtra has always been an important region. Okay? कल के लिए भी बहुत important. Right? I mean, think of it. There are 4 states in India: Maharashtra, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka. These 4 states together contribute 75% or 3/4 of India's GDP. यही हो रहा सारा विकास अब यहां पे भी होने लगा है नॉर्थ में, देख ही रहे चौतरफा. Now, these are the 4 Anglo-Mysore wars. Now coming to Marathas. Maratha wars, first 1775 to 82, then 1803 to 1805, and then 1817 to 1819. 3 Anglo-Maratha wars. I'm not going to go into the details right now, but आप एक चीज देख सकते हैं यहाँ, और इसको आप बना के थोड़ा अपनी कॉपी के पहले पेज पे चिपका लीजिए. अभी नहीं बोल रहा दीवार पे, क्योंकि आप अगर दीवार पे चिपकाना अभी से चालू हो गया तो दीवारें भर जाएंगी, है ना. तो what do you see? At least one thing you can see. Something that begins here. This is the first time where the first Anglo-Carnatic war is where the British are getting into a overt political interference and fight. और जो 1750 में कहीं चालू हुआ, the process that started in 1750 takes another almost 60-70 years. कि by 1820 the British had defeated. By 1820 the British had defeated Marathas also. Before that, Mysore, Hyderabad, Carnatic, Bengal और अवध भी. By which year? 1819. और यहां रह गया था पंजाब, रंजीत सिंह. Ranjit Singh died in 1839, and once Ranjit Singh dies, ये राजस्थान को आप भूल जाइए इसमें यहाँ से. Once Ranjit Singh dies in 1839, Punjab also starts falling. But पंजाब को आप भूल भी जाइए अभी, तो भी by 1820, the British had outsmarted all major. By 1820 meaning by Maratha decline. 1820 meaning 1920. By 1890, with the decline of Maratha power, it became clear कि who will now rule India? Who will now establish a unified political state of their own? The British. So it is by 1820s the picture starts becoming clear कि मुगल्स के बाद अगर पैन इंडिया रूल बनेगा तो किसका बनेगा. It is the British. The intervening 100 years, nobody, even in the Satta Bazar, could tell with what? Confidence who will be the next pan-Indian ruler, or whether there will be a pan-Indian ruler or not. आप में से जिन्होंने मेडिवल पढ़ लिया है उन्होंने देखा होगा कि मेडिवल में नॉर्थ में डिफरेंट रूलर थे, डेक्कन में डिफरेंट रूलर थे, साउथ में डिफरेंट रूलर थे, है ना? पढ़ा होगा आपने, किसी ने पढ़ा होगा कि आज किसी ने पिक्चर देखी होगी PS1, कोई पिक्चर आई थी पॉनी सेल्वन 1, मैंने तो देखी नहीं, बट जिसने देखी हो तो भाई चोलाज वर एट देयर पीक एट बिटवीन 800 AD से 1100 AD तक, है ना? तो देयर वाज नो वन रूलिंग फ्रॉम दिल्ली ओवर हुम? चेन्नई तो खैर तब था ही नहीं, चेन्नई को तो ब्रिटिश ने बनाया, बट देयर वाज नोबडी फ्रॉम दिल्ली रूलिंग ओवर हुम? Cholas. But Cholas were ruling everywhere where they could lay their hands on, over whole of South India, over Sri Lanka, and indirectly ruling over Myanmar also, Malaysia also, Indonesia also. The Chola navy was the most powerful navy. तो इसका मतलब ये है, मैं आपको बस एक चीज बता रहा हूं कि जो दिल्ली पे राज करेगा वो पूरे देश पे राज करेगा, ये इतिहास नहीं कहता, यह बहुत छोटा इतिहास कहता है. We sitting in North India, North Indians assume what happens in North India. देखिए, अगर आप यूपी और बिहार में रहे हैं, मैं रहा हूं काफी टाइम, तो मुझे पता है कि यूपी में अगर आप रह रहे हैं तो आपको लगेगा कि यही है दुनिया. भारत तो खैर इतना ही है ना? But if you have spent some time in Tamil Nadu or in Kerala, which also I have had the luxury of doing, you will realize that they don't feel the same enthusiasm about such a assumption. And it is not a rivalry between North Indian people and South Indian people. ऐसा कुछ नहीं है, कोई ऐसा rivalry नहीं है. North South Indian people also, they'll come here, you also eat dosa, idli. I don't think you have a problem. You're like, I never heard a North Indian saying I will not eat dosa or idli. I will only eat roti sabji because I am from North. Never heard. And neither I have heard the opposite there. So forget there's no such element of such rivalry between people, but still you will see that we often forget that different power centers have historically emerged in the Indian subcontinent at different times. Sometimes in the north, sometimes in the south, and at times both in the north and south at the same time. Okay, so we need to take a more bigger understanding. I'll give you a very foreign policy based understanding. India today is well aware that India's states, some Indian states like Tamil Nadu, for example, sends a huge diaspora to where? Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia. So India's relations with these countries will influence a large number of Tamils. You know Canada. Canada means Punjab. Influence. Andhra Pradesh. The Telugus from Andhra Pradesh find a significant presence in US tech sector. You have your Sundar Pichais to whatever. So they are also power centers. It's not just in Delhi. Okay. So try to develop a more, थोड़ा सा दिमाग को आप खोल के चलेंगे तो आपको और चीजें इवेंचुअली समझ में आएंगी. Why am I saying so? Because when the British in 1700s are looking at the subcontinent, the power centers, the economic power centers and the political power centers, for example, are in Bengal, for example, are in Maharashtra, of what you know as Maharashtra today, are in Mysore, are in Hyderabad and Karnataka. दिल्ली की बात कर रहा हूं क्या मैं? बोला दिल्ली का 1739 Delhi is done and dusted. When the British established the capital in India, the first power center that the British established for them, their rule in India was where? Calcutta. It is only after 1911 they announced that they are shifting the capital to Delhi. Right? So different power centers have emerged at different times. There is nothing inevitable about whom? दिल्ली. देखिए आप में से कितने लोग दिल्ली के हैं? कम ही है. तो देखिए दिल्ली के बारे में क्या है, लोग कहते हैं कि दिल्ली दिल वालों की है. मैं काफी टाइम से रह रहा हूं दिल्ली में, मुझे ऐसा कभी फील नहीं हुआ. दिल्ली गुस्से वालों की है, फील आपको हो ही चुका हो. जल्दी वालों की है, नाराजगी वालों की है, ईगो वालों की है, रेड लाइट तोड़ने वालों की होगी. दिल वालों की, वो दिल वाले थोड़े कम दिखते हैं. तो what I'm saying is that Delhi is not a power center when during this 1700 to 1800 period. Okay, it again became a power center 1900s के बाद. चल ना, और आपने जिसने एंशिएंट हिस्ट्री पढ़ी होगी उसने पढ़ा ही होगा कि पहले तो कहां था, पटना, और फिर वहां से चलते चलते हम इधर आ गए, है ना. तो पावर सेंटर्स बदलते रहे हैं. Now, coming to now the period from 1800s to 1900s. देखिए पहला दिन है तो मैं 7:30 बजे छोड़ दूंगा. आफ्टर द फर्स्ट 2 और 3 लेक्चर अपन थोड़ा लंबा लंबा भी पढ़ लेंगे ताकि ढंग से पढ़ भी पाए और सिलेबस भी कॉम्प्रोमाइज ना हो ना. और आपको पता है विमेन सेफ्टी तो है ही दिल्ली में बहुत, कोई डाउट है आपको तो कोई नहीं, पर मैं कीपिंग दैट आल्सो इन माइंड 7:45 तक तो मैं नॉर्मली आपको छोड़ ही दूं, है ना. तो 1800s to 1900 इज अ वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट पीरियड बिकॉज 1820 तक मैंने आपको बोल दिया, क्लियर है कि अब ब्रिटिश का ही राज होना है. पर एक प्रॉब्लम, the problem in the 1800 to 1900 period is this, that the one in charge of operations in India is the East India Company. By the way, the East India Company at this point of time is the world's most powerful and profitable company. इतिहास में इतनी कंपनियां नहीं रही हैं जिनकी अपनी प्राइवेट आर्मी रही हो, and the East India Company was one of them. Okay, now it is at this time that the British East India Company and the British Crown had a ongoing what? Tussle or ongoing tension between the two. Between the two, there is a certain tension now developing. Why? Because the East India Company is like, we want to continue our monopoly. But 1700s में the East India Company first came as whom? As a trader. But now they want to be rulers. Now a lot of you may be thinking कि when the British East India Company came in 1600 में बन गई थी, है ना. तो ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी was formed with the objective that East India Company will rule over South Asia. The short answer is no. East India Company was never formed with this objective. It was formed as a trading entity. It is only by 1760s and 70s that the East India Company saw a very clear opportunity where they said, we are making a lot of money through what? Through trade, by buying Indian goods and selling it in Europe. But ये दिल मांगे, आज तक आपके दिल ने कभी कहा है कि नहीं यार बहुत हुआ, बस क्या करोगे, रहने दो. क्या लेके आए थे और क्या लेके जाएंगे। झोला लेके आए थे और हम झोला लेके जाएंगे, ऐसा आपने सोचा कभी? नेक्स्ट, अब सोचो। The East India Company was making huge profits when? By 1750s and 60s, but it wanted more, and they realized we are profiting by doing trade with India, but we can make even more money if we start collecting what? Acha, who is the richest entity in India? Ambani, Adani? Anybody else? Government. Rightly so. Who is the most powerful? Forget powerful, who is the most richest entity in India? It is the government. Isn't it? आपको किसी को डाउट है? सरकार से ज्यादा अमीर कोई नहीं, सरकार से बड़ा स्टार्टअप कोई नहीं। सरकार को फंडिंग कौन देता है? टैक्स। The East India Company said, if we become the rulers, we can make money not just by doing trade, but by collecting land revenue, tax. And they said that we can do one thing, we can do a good arrangement. Let Indian rulers rule. We will collect taxes on behalf of Indian rulers. उनको रूल करने दो, तुम रखो अपना महल, your perks, your privileges, your palaces, you keep everything. Let us only collect taxes on your behalf. We are here to make money. And every time in 1700s, the wars we wrote, the British won. They never started ruling India. In 1700s, the British are not administering a Bengal, a Hyderabad, a Carnatic, a Mysore directly. No, they are saying, you do the rule, we'll collect the taxes. The East India Company by 1800s is emerging as a tax collecting entity. A portion of the taxes it would keep for itself, some it would give to the rulers for administration. खर्चा भी तो होगा ना administration में, you have to give salaries, everything. So 1750s to 1800s, the British East India Company establishing which rule? Direct rule or indirect rule? Indirect rule. It is saying trade से तो पैसा बन ही रहा है, let me also collect tax. And who's becoming more and more richer? The East India Company. And then the crown says a very simple thing. ये tax collect करना तो हमारा काम है. So the crown says to the East India Company, आप हो जाइए side. हम करेंगे tax collect. Administration is not your job. Tax collection is a part of administration. You are traders, you do trade. We will do administration. By that they mean tax collection. The East India Company like नहीं, लड़ाई हमने की, जीते हम, पैसा बनाने की बारी आई तो अब आप बोल रहे हैं कि the crown is saying that no, we will collect. East India Company said no. East India Company said खरीद लो, किसको? सरकार को. किस सरकार को? Crown. For 50 years, East India Company kept bribing British parliamentarians left, right, center कि we should be allowed to continue playing whatever role we are playing in India and the crown must not interfere. चलता रहा कब तक? 1857 तक. The revolt of 1857 खूब लड़ी मर्दानी, वो तो झांसी वाली है ना. Are you proud of your rulers? Like everybody is proud of the fact that Jhansi ki Rani was a valorous ruler, was a brave ruler. But what was she fighting for? She was fighting so that her rule, her kingdom is not taken over by the British. अभी मैं ओवर सिंप्लीफाई करके बात कर रहा हूँ, but ये everybody is heard, right? And because her son was not being recognized as the ruler, her son was also a शहजादा, है ना? So Indians don't have a problem with what? Dynasty politics. है क्या? Every country is a country of dynasty politics, not just Indian country. इतिहास गवाह है, इंडिया की बात छोड़ दीजिए, आप यूएस को देख लीजिए. यूएस कहते हैं ना मदर ऑफ ओल्डेस्ट, नहीं मदर तो हम है, ओल्डेस्ट है, नहीं ओल्डेस्ट भी वो है, नहीं ओल्डेस्ट भी हम ही, ओल्डेस्ट डेमोक्रेसी है ना. कहते आपने चोला एम्पायर का पढ़ा होगा तो फिर आपने जिसने पढ़ा होगा लगे नहीं वहां डेमोक्रेसी, हमारे यहाँ वहां तब भी थी. खैर ये सब बातें होती हैं, बोलने के लिए बहुत अच्छी लगती है. Obama said, he addressed a joint session of the Indian Parliament where he said, it is a relationship between the oldest democracy, that is the United States, and the largest democracy, that is India. माहौल बनाने के लिए oldest, largest, joest करना आपको करते नहीं. So, चलिए, what I am coming back to here is the important point, that the 1857 is a landmark year, because now the crown says, the revolt of 1857 happened. Why? Because Indian princely states like Jhansi and like many other states like Awadh and many other states rebelled against whom? The mismanagement caused by whom? The British East India Company. The East India Company is not fit to rule. They were never fit to rule. And the 1857 is a result of the mismanagement by the East India Company. It's time for East India Company to pack up its bag and leave. Who will now take over? The crown in all forms of administration. So we say कि जो आपने 1760 से लड़ाइयां लिखी, from 1760s to 1850s, the British East India Company rule was an indirect rule. From 1857 to 1947, the British Crown takes over, which is a more direct rule. ये indirect or direct? When the British East India Company is ruling indirectly, who is also ruling? The Indian princely states. Okay. And once the crown takes over, the crown is saying that we will be the predominant players. Broadly oversimplifying right now. इसमें कई details मैं बाद में जोड़ूंगा. But आप यहाँ पे 2-3 points लिख लीजिए, फिर मैं आपको, if you have quite doubts, you can ask doubts. Otherwise, you can go and prepare for tomorrow's historic day. तो यहाँ पे आप 2-3 पॉइंट्स लिख लीजिए. एवरीबॉडी इज अंडरस्टूड टिल हियर? आपको समझ में आ गया? ऐसा तो नहीं लगा कि क्या बकवास चल रही है, ये इसका क्या रेलेवेंस है? रेलेवेंस धीमे धीमे आएगा. आप पहले एक ब्रॉड पिक्चर देख लीजिए. नाउ you can write down here that from 1760s to 1820s, the British East India Company was keen to establish its indirect rule over Indian princely states, where it sought to expand its presence beyond trading what? Monopolies into the arena of revenue, administration or tax, what? Or tax collection, where it sought to expand its presence beyond trading monopolies into the area of revenue administration or tax collection. Everybody writing is clear? Okay. If your writing is poor than mine, you should improve. Because my writing is also barely understandable. Now, what is happening? 1800s to 1857, जो मैंने पहले आपको लिखा कि there is an ongoing tussle between whom? The British East India Company and the British Crown. The Crown was keen to take over. The Crown was keen to take over administrative powers from whom? From the British East India Company. एक interesting सवाल आपसे पूछता हूँ. If the British East India Company was a private company which could bribe parliamentarians and raise a private army of its own and could resist the might of the British Empire for a good 50 years, can you think that Apple or a Microsoft or a Tesla or a Google, I have not named any Indian company because why should I? Can they have private armies and bribe their parliament, bribe their elected leaders? Can they? If history is a guide, they can. मैं तो बोल रहा हूँ can. But not just about bribing, but also about raising private armies. Do you know that there are private armies which exist in the world? For example, there's Blackwater Incorporation. It's a private army based on the United States. The US government also takes its services from time to time. And if you have the amount of money to pay, it can fight for you also, wherever you want it to fight. Okay. These are called as mercenary armies. History proves and history tells you that in 1700s in India also, there were a number of mercenary armies. And not just in India, but in Europe also and in the world over also. There have been mercenary armies in the past. Okay. You would have read, if you would have been reading newspapers for 1 or 2 years, you would have read a year or so ago, the Wagner group in Ukraine was fighting on behalf of the Russian state as a mercenary army. Right? Mercenary army is which army? You say, I want you to fight on my behalf in X country. I will pay you $2 billion. Are you ready to fight? They're like, lao paisa, we are ready to fight. Okay. So the British had their own, but the British East India Company had a standing army. It did not have a mercenary army. मतलब full time army बना रखा था, है ना? So it's unique, it's impressive, but it is also a guide that if the East India Company, which was the world's most profitable company at the time, could do so, others can do so. Apple's net worth a year ago, because मैंने उसका देखना बंद कर दिया, मेरे को क्या ही फर्क. Apple's net worth a year ago was $3 trillion. $3 trillion is India's GDP. It is more than the GDP of 50 or 60 countries. If Apple would have been a country, it would have been the third or the fourth biggest economy in the whole world. So if Apple wants to raise the army, it can. The question is, does it need to raise the army? Maybe in its calculation it doesn't. Because maybe somebody else is ready to pick up their war. When they want them to fight, somebody is ready to fight for them. So why do they need to? They can focus on Mars. Tesla kid. What is the name? Elon Musk. उन्होंने बोला ये धरती वर्ती तुम देखो. चलो Mars. Right? You think it is stupidity? Do you realize that the boldness of their, I'm not saying good or bad, I'm saying that the boldness of their thought, do you think it comes from ignorance or stupidity? It comes from intelligence and it comes from sheer power. अरे आप सोचिए ना, आपकी सोच का दायरा ही कितना लिमिटेड है. आप सोच रहे हैं ये प्लॉट खरीद लूं, ये प्लॉट खरीद लूं, ये प्लॉट खरीद लूं. वो सोच रहा है वो प्लैनेट ठीक है, वहां चलते हैं. ये यहाँ बहुत लोग भी ज्यादा है, कंजेशन भी ज्यादा है, क्लाइमेट चेंज भी हो रहा है, एंड यू हैव टू डील विद सच लोली फिगर्स. बताओ कौन सा अच्छा लग रहा है. इट कम्स, दिस कम्स फ्रॉम यू में से विजन कि सर वो बहुत विजनरी होंगे, बट वो दे आर वेरी इंटेलिजेंट. बट इंटेलिजेंट तो बहुत लोग, इंटेलिजेंस की दुनिया में कमी नहीं है, हार्डवर्क की भी इस दुनिया में कमी नहीं है. आप पॉलिटिकल साइंस में एक ही चीज पढ़ेंगे बार बार, पावर पावर पावर. पावर बाय इट्स वेरी नेचर इज अ जीरो सम इक्वेशन. देखिए आप कितने भी इंटेलिजेंट हो सकते हैं और मैं भी कितना इंटेलिजेंस हो सकता हूं, लेकिन आपकी इंटेलिजेंस मेरी इंटेलिजेंस को कम नहीं कर रही. इट्स नॉट अ जीरो सम इक्वेशन, बट पावर बाय इट्स वेरी नेचर इज अ जीरो सम इक्वेशन. मेरे पास जितनी ज्यादा होगी ऑटोमेटिकली आपके पास उतनी क्या हो जाएगी, कम हो जाएगी. व्हाट इज दिस राइवलरी? It is a power rivalry between the East India Company and the British Crown. That tussle is what? A power rivalry, right? So, it is quite much possible that Amazon बना रहा हो शटल, कुछ बना रहा ना Amazon भी, स्पेस में भेजने वाला, reusable rockets, and Amazon also has a company now, right? NASA has started outsourcing. देखिए मैं ज्यादा नहीं पढ़ता, आपको मुझसे ज्यादा पढ़ लेना चाहिए, है ना? NASA has started outsourcing, sending what? Launch vehicles into space to American private companies like SpaceX, like Amazon का Deep Blue या क्या है जो भी ना, I don't know. There's some. Amazon is doing, Tesla is doing. And they're doing it with whose support? The government support, right? Because there's a certain understanding that you focus here. हम देख लेते हैं बाहर का मिनरल एक्सप्लोरेशन बाहर करेंगे, है ना? सो यू मे थिंक दैट हाउ स्टूपिड इज दिस, दैट दिस फेलो इज थिंकिंग दैट वी विल गो एंड एस्टैब्लिश आवर प्रेजेंस ऑन मार्स. आप सोच सकते हैं ना कि क्या वेस्ट कर रहा है टाइम और मेहनत, बट दिस इज पावर. वो वहां सोच रहे हैं जहां हम अभी सोच भी नहीं पा रहे, है ना? तो ये एक फैक्ट है. अब इसके आगे मैं नहीं बोलूंगा कुछ की, छोड़िए, चलिए अब लिख लीजिए. नाउ just one more thing, a couple of more lines and I'll leave you. So Crown was keen to take over the administrative powers from the British East India Company, and the ongoing tussle between the two and in the ongoing, and you can write here, and in the ongoing tussle between the two witnessed a major shift with the balance of power tilting decisively in favor of whom? The British East India Company. Where? In favor of the British East India Company. Where? Shifting decisively in favor of the British East India Company. Sorry, in favor of the British Crown. After the revolt of 1857. After 1857, as the Crown argued that the British East India Company, as the Crown argued, that the British East India Company was incompetent in administrative affairs. Was incompetent in administrative affairs. And tilting decisively in favor of the British Crown. Tilting decisively in favor of the British Crown after the revolt of 1857. And as the Crown argued that the British East India Company was incompetent in administrative affairs. तो बस आप यहाँ पे एक चीज और लिख लीजिए कि 1760s to 1857 there is the indirect rule of the British East India Company, and after 1857 to 1947 there is the direct rule of the British Crown. यहाँ पे the direct rule is of whom? Indian princely states. तो यहां पे डायरेक्ट रूल इज ऑफ इंडियन प्रिंसली स्टेट्स एंड इनडायरेक्ट रूल इज ऑफ द ब्रिटिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी. थैंक यू. I'll see you tomorrow. Any doubts still there? कल हम जब तक मिलेंगे एक नया इतिहास, एक नया एरा चालू हो चुका, राइट? हाँ ये तो रह गया. अब बुक्स कल बात कर लेते हैं, क्या हो गया? कल कर लेंगे, अदरवाइज विल गेट लेट, क्योंकि बुक्स का फिर ये बुक वो बुक कल बात करते हैं. कल फर्स्ट थिंग विल टॉक इज बुक्स. डन. थैंक यू फॉर योर टाइम.